On today's episode, I've got Tom Coughlin. Tom is a performance nutrition expert with a master's in sport and exercise nutrition and a bachelor's in sports psychology. He's one of the top consultants for elite sporting teams and athletes, currently working with Hibs Football Club, and was a lead nutritionist for Scotland Rugby. We talked about youth player nutrition, what match day fueling should look like and what you should be prioritising, your recovery nutrition, what it's like to feed a whole team, how subs should eat versus starters, in-season, off-season and pre-season, and what you should be focusing on, and how individual diets for players are different. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. All right, welcome to the Football Feast podcast. I'm sitting here with Tom Coughlin. Welcome to the podcast, Tom.
Thanks very much for having me, Craig.
Yeah, no, thank you very much for stopping by. Tom, can you give us a bit of a summary of your journey and maybe where you're at right now?
Yeah, for sure. So, as a basic overview, I've worked in elite sport for just over 8 years. I've worked primarily in team sport. I've always been a fan of team sports myself, so it seemed an inevitability that I would end up working in there. I've done a lot of work in rugby, but more recently in professional football as well, either with individuals or teams. I run my own business, so I consult with various teams and individual athletes as well. I also do some work in industry too, so it's almost the complete spectrum of what a performance nutritionist can do.
Yeah, wow. That's wonderful. You're definitely the right guy to have on the show. All right, so where sort of did your passion for nutrition come from? Did you do were you studying in one direction or were you planning on going one in a certain direction and then just drifted that way?
Yeah, I'd always been a bit of a foodie. I think we oftentimes get passions in our lives from our parents, and my parents are definitely of that ilk as well. But I again, I always wanted to do something in sport. I'd always been sporty, so I decided when I was fortunate enough to get to go to uni, I started doing a joint honours in sports science and psychology. And it was only really in third year when we did a sports nutrition module. I always say that is the one time that I started doing the extra reading for university, which probably isn't a good sign for the academics that are listening, but it was the one thing that just really connected with me. And I just thought, well, this is what I want to do. Bought all the textbooks that are way overpriced. Did all the reading, and then I was like, right, how do I become a performance nutritionist or at least work more in nutrition? And then decided I needed to go to Loughborough University to do my master's. I was fortunate enough to get in there, and that allowed me to, once I graduated, be on the SENR register and work in elite sports. So yeah, it was just that one module back in third year when I thought, yeah, this is what I want to do.
Yeah, fantastic. I can definitely resonate with that actually. That's sort of my direction and sort of how I unfolded mine. Jumped into uni and was chasing a Bachelor of Health Science. And yeah, I found myself chasing down those textbooks and hovering definitely directly towards nutrition and sports nutrition in particular.
Mhm. Yeah.
Yeah, wonderful. Okay, so can you sort of give us an idea of because we see sort of the science experts on Instagram, and then there's also a lot of social media experts out there as well who are sort of plugging things but don't have the full scale of knowledge behind them. And I guess it's important to sort of keep an eye on you guys and make sure that, we're checking in with the right people.
Yeah, I think it's really challenging, genuinely, for athletes or just people that are interested in nutrition because there's this whole world of social media out there, and algorithms promote certain people that maybe do things in a certain way, and oftentimes that doesn't necessarily align with real expertise on a topic. I could, I suppose, make the case that I'm trying to become a bit of a social media expert myself, trying to grow there, posting up content, and it can be really difficult to differentiate between someone that actually knows what they're talking about, or at least has some professional and qualified experience, versus someone who.
False Nine Football make high quality retro jerseys from all of your favourite teams. Jump onto their website at www.false9footballau.com and put in TFN10 at their checkout for 10% off your next purchase. That's TFN10.
Maybe has their heart in the right place when they're trying to promote science, but maybe aren't doing it in the right way, and it can be really challenging. There are obvious qualifications that you can look for certain people, like SENR register. I know I've said that before, or if they have some sort of background in science, like hold an MSc in sports nutrition or health sciences, or something specific to that. Where really the waters get quite murky is you get people that are qualified or have PhDs in topics that aren't necessarily relevant to nutrition. And that leads to a point where they maybe interpret the science in a way that isn't necessarily reflective of what it actually says. And that can cause even more confusion for the people that are trying to get good messages. So it is incredibly difficult. I would say to anyone listening, you've at least got two people here that you can maybe follow that can maybe give you a good message. But it can be very difficult to identify who is telling fact from fiction.
Yeah, definitely. And I want to plug like your Instagram at least at the end of the show, because I definitely want my community and the people that do watch this to, to definitely follow the right people and, the work that you're doing. And I appreciate it as well, because it's hard to, get your head around all of the studies that come out and what people are doing. And your breakdown and summary of those studies is really simple and really easy for people that maybe don't have the degree or the science background to sort of just get a quick read and understand what you've put out there and what the study sort of ends up being, and can use that.
Nice. Thanks, Craig.
That's all right. So do you have any advice for sort of players, football players or parents of young football players that sort of dream to become the best, nutrition wise? How early should they be thinking about it, and what kind of difference can it make?
Yeah, I mean it's probably one of the most key areas to get right in youth sport, because really, if you're trying to identify a population that requires the most in terms of nutrition support, I you could definitely make the case that youth athletes probably need more nutrition support than professional athletes a lot of times, simply because they've not just got the demands of the sport, but they probably train in multiple sports as well, and they're going through this massive period of development too. So they've got all these other factors to that go into this equation in terms of how much fuel that they need, the kind of foods that they need as well. Really, the good thing, it's putting that to one side, is you can make significant progress as a youth athlete just by doing the basics really well. So eating multiple times a day, not trying to skip meals, making sure you're getting in your fruit and veg, you're eating healthy sources of protein, and eating enough carbohydrate too. I've seen so many athletes, be them, I suppose, youth athletes, let's say from, even as young as like 10 or 11, going all the way through the teen years, that maybe don't have the best diet, and they're sort of a bit all over the place and underfueling quite heavily. And just from focusing on some of the basics, like eating carbohydrates at each meal or eating like 2 to 3 snacks a day on top of your meals, can actually have a significant benefit in terms of their energy levels, their fueling, and all these things are going to add together towards them being a better athlete too. So again, a simple thing can have a very positive outcome when we're talking about team sport, or let's say youth sport and nutrition.
Yeah, definitely. And I think, the earlier they put these things in place and getting it right early, it's all going to add up. Those one percenters,
Mhm.
they're all going to add up, and it's going to add to the longevity of the player. And even just like the like looking after the long-term health and making sure, we
Mhm.
don't have like cardiovascular things pop up later in life.
Yeah.
We're looking after their bone health. Yeah, we're making sure these people, not just the players and not just sport-wise, but the longevity of the human as well.
Yeah, you're ultimately putting them in a place where they're becoming a healthy human being first, and actually, they're gonna have loads of crossovers in terms of performance too. I mean, I always when I'm working with a youth athlete as well, I always try and tell them that back when I was that age or in school, like my diet was absolutely horrendous. And I'm not necessarily an elite athlete, but it is the norm for a lot of young people to have maybe not the best diet in the world, and even just simple fixes at that point can massively add up. So yeah, you're spot on with that, Craig.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, all right. So we sort of discussed a bit about that. Can you sort of explain what fueling for a match day should look like? So maybe macros and sort of timing of that and where to put the right things in the right places, I guess.
Yeah. Again, like I think it's got to be in the context of lots of athletes maybe aren't fueling enough. And so what I try and promote initially or try and check with an athlete is, are they just eating balanced the day before? So making sure they're getting in carbohydrates at each main meal and probably a couple of snacks as well. Like I've personally over the course of the preseason with one of the teams I work with had a look at this in a bit more detail and see if actually we do really need to carb load as many people promote and what a lot of the science says. Because again, from my experience, you get a lot of athletes that when you're trying to promote really high carb intakes the day before a match, which is the sort of traditional approach, they do struggle with that. So we've had a look in terms of just an in-house study at a more moderate approach to carbohydrate eating, doing the basics well, and eating a slightly elevated carbohydrate diet, but not going over the top in terms of like 6 grams per kilo of carbohydrate. Now, again, that's in rugby. In football, you could argue that footballers might actually need to get up to that level of carbohydrate intake because they've got higher running volumes. It's a slightly different sport. It's not as stop start. Um, but general rule of thumb is you'll probably need to increase your carbohydrates compared to your normal diet the day before a match, specifically around dinner. And then you're almost taking a bit of weight off that match day because you're fueled up. You're getting in all that energy. It's not going to completely diminish overnight. You will drop a little bit, and therefore you need to have a good pre-exercise meal, and maybe eat a little bit more as well, depending on what time your kickoff is. But the day before a match, decent high carb dinner. So you're probably looking at some sort of pasta based meal, some sort of rice based meal as well. Maybe getting a side of bread in there as well. And I'm always a fan of desserts too. It's a good opportunity to get in some tasty food at that point. So something like that is a really good structure in terms of eating the day before a match.
Yeah, I find that as well. I definitely, when you're recommending a dessert, they're usually quite happy to take that on board. That's for sure. But it's funny, like the amount of players that come to me and, we'll do like a 7 day sort of review of what they've been eating. And they're coming to me with like 200 grams or 250 grams, within that 24-hour period before their match. And we just
Mhm.
bump it up like a little bit. Like I'll bump it up like 50 to 70 to 100 grams, but like gradually do that and sort of let the player get used to eating that little bit extra.
Mhm.
And we'll sort of build that up. But even after the first week, I'm adding 50 grams just before their game, and the player comes to me and they're like, "Wow, like honestly, I had so much energy," and
Mhm.
even like their body weight doesn't go up, and they're just amazed
Yep.
by it. Like I'm eating more, my body weight's not really increasing, but I've got so much more energy on the pitch at trainings and stuff like that. So yeah, I think once they take that little bit on board and it starts happening, they
Mhm.
start believing a bit more.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you're spot on. And historically in endurance sports, we've seen this approach of training the gut in terms of fueling up and getting used to a higher carbohydrate intake during exercise. But I suppose that concept could almost be applied to fueling the day before a match for team sport athletes as well. And I suppose I'd pair training the gut with training the mind too, to be able to understand that just because you're eating carbs, you're not necessarily going to gain loads of weight. It's not going to go straight to body fat too. And taking that gradual approach, like you said, Craig, is super useful for the athlete to understand that, yes, I'm seeing the performance outcomes, but also I don't need to worry about some of the potential side effects that I'm creating in my own mind with regards to carbohydrate intake. So yeah, training the gut and training the mind using that more gradual approach is definitely a good one to do.
Yeah, it's always much easier once we can get that athlete buy-in quicker, that's for sure. Um, all right, fantastic. So what about recovery from matches or, high intensity training sessions? Is there anything our athletes should be sort of thinking about or prioritizing?
Yeah, I think oftentimes trying to eat something, and it doesn't necessarily have to be the most optimal thing immediately after the match. Oftentimes, like if they're, let's say, an adult athlete, there'll be some sort of supplementation involved with hitting your 3 Rs, like your rehydrate, refuel, rebuild. standard recovery drink or product immediately after a match. And that doesn't need to be a supplement as well. It could be some sort of milk-based drink. And then trying to get in some kind of food immediately. Well, not immediately, but as soon after that as possible. Again, having some good sources of some protein, carbohydrates, and probably some electrolytes in there as well. Like one of my big things that I try and do with teams is sushi. I think that is like one of the most ultimate recovery foods because it's small portions too, so it doesn't need to be a huge amount of food that they're eating. Lots of players, from my experience, love that kind of food as well. They can take it away with them. It doesn't have to be served hot or whatever, so it's highly practical too. Can be a bit on the expensive side, so might not be the best approach for everyone. But something like that would be great. And then you're looking at that sort of next layer of recovery, maybe within the 24 hours after the match. So trying to load up on dietary sources of antioxidants, polyphenols, trying to elevate your omega-3 intake as well, which I suppose like it's definitely optimal in terms of recovery. Is it the most practical thing to do? Sometimes it's not, because that day after the match might be one of the only times that player has to chill out and maybe spend some time with their family. If they've got young kids or whatever, they might be up at 7 a.m. chasing them around the park or whatever, which probably isn't the best thing for recovery, and they'll be out eating with them. But there are certain suggestions, like I mentioned before, increasing omega intake, increasing antioxidant intake, loading up on leafy greens. These are all really good things that you can do to boost your recovery. It's just the practicality side of things that you got to think about.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think hydration is another one to point out there as well, is
Yeah, of
making sure
course.
they rehydrate and get that on board as fast as possible. Um, what about so if you've got really hard training during the week or lighter intensity trainings, would you then suggest your players to maybe eat a bit more carbs prior to the higher intensity training sessions?
Yeah, I think again, like there's been more of a push in the industry to treating high intensity training sessions a bit more like games, and therefore, yes, your fueling beforehand probably does need to fuel a little bit. Like when I'm looking at designing menus for teams, I'll oftentimes layer in some elements of periodization. So, for example, a higher intensity day, a double day with lots of running, I'll tend to have higher carb intake just from the kind of foods that I'm selecting in those menus, even down to, let's say, salad, keeping them more sort of compound based, maybe having some pasta in that salad as well, or some couscous or some grains. And then having some more compound dishes too, in terms of, let's say, like a lasagna, as opposed to the standard sort of protein and then carbohydrate separately, just so you're naturally increasing the carbohydrate intake in the athlete's diet. So yes, there would definitely be some adjustments there, and same thing with recovery too. So having them probably maybe slightly lower carbohydrate, but loading up on the fruit and veg in the diet as well at that point, and having some more proteins that are higher in omega-3, like salmon and oily fish and these kind of things too. So yeah, you should definitely adjust what you're eating throughout the week based on the kind of training that you're doing.
Yeah, absolutely. And for instance, for recovery days, would you suggest your athletes sort of lower their intake down on those days?
Yeah, it depends what they're doing. Oftentimes you have different groups of players that some will be recovering and some will be getting in some extra work because maybe they haven't been involved the day before. So there does need to be some sort of flexibility in those menus too, but it's just about promoting the players doing the right kind of things based on their individual needs. But certainly there would be more omega-3 intake, higher, let's say, vitamin C content and these kind of things on specific recovery days for the majority of the team.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, what about for off season? So between in season, off season, do you guys have a sort of, I guess, educate your players to sort of change things up a bit when they're going to off season?
Yeah, I think off season's a great opportunity as well to maybe get a bit out of that week to week routine when it comes to nutrition. Like I don't know whether it's the same over there, but like usual pre-match dinner is like lasagna, something like that. So it's quite nice to sort of come out of that routine a little bit and just stay away from that kind of stuff for off season. But yeah, I think it's a good opportunity to maybe try something a little bit different. potentially get some good body composition changes with athletes as well. So you don't have to necessarily worry about that constant like fueling up and recovery cycle. You can have more of a body comp focus in the off season to get then a heads up going into preseason too. So let's say an athlete does need to drop body fat. I'd much rather them do that over the off season than the preseason, just because you don't necessarily want to have a negative energy balance going into preseason where training volumes are so high too. I think that's a recipe for injury risk increasing. So I think off season is a great opportunity to focus on individual needs for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. So you suggest to them to sort of increase their protein intake on during off season, maybe reduce the carbohydrate intake, and then leading into preseason, you start bumping that or ramping up that carbohydrate intake again.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. And like even there might be some guys that maybe need to put on a little bit of size in the off season and they struggle during the preseason and in season periods. So yeah, that would almost be increasing your carbs just almost in advance in terms of the off season is very individual. Certainly at with a lot of the athletes and teams I've worked with, there is now a bit more of an individual approach when it comes to goals, not necessarily specifically to nutrition, but also S&C, prehab, and coaching work-ons too from the guys that are in charge of that side of things.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, actually. Like people sort of see things or they'll hear that their mate did this or went with that diet and it
Mhm.
worked for them or they're on those macros. And that's really good to think about. Like, it doesn't necessarily apply for you. And, there's sort of biomarkers and, watching the scales and monitoring certain things and, skin fold tests and stuff like that. And sort of it's very individualized and it's so many differences that, yeah, until you're sort of working with the player individually, that
Mhm.
it's really hard to explain to them. And once they start seeing it, then once again, you're getting that buy-in.
Yeah, for sure. The general concepts that can affect or be positive for the majority of players. But at the end of the day, like there are so many individual differences, like you say, Craig, that you do need to have that more sort of one-to-one and individualized approach to really maximize their outcome as an athlete.
Yeah. All right. So I've got some short questions here for you, Tom. Um, First one is, who is your favorite football player?
I think it's got to be back in the day, like Zidane was just my absolute idol back when I was playing a bit of football too. I've clearly followed him with the kind of hairstyle too, so he really is my idol from that standpoint. But he was just genius. I always remember that game against Brazil too in the World Cup. Where I just watched those highlight reels for ages and ages. So definitely Zidane.
It's no surprise that we've both got the same idol then. That's funny. All right. So what football team do you support then?
So I support, in terms of Scottish football, Hibs. Yes, because that's the main team that I work with up here.
Okay, beautiful. Um, if you could have a superpower, what would it be?
Oh, good question. Probably teleportation, just because you could save so much time in your schedule.
Yeah, absolutely. I completely understand that one. I wouldn't mind that. What is your favorite meal?
Hmm. I'm a big fan of pizza. I love pizza. Get anchovies on there, bit of blue cheese, caramelized onion chutney. I've got my go-to 100%.
Oh, I love caramelized onion. I swear I could have it with everything. Um, so yeah, if you could quit being a nutritionist and working with teams at the moment, and you could become an elite athlete of any sport, what would you choose?
Ooh. Would my right question back to you, would my skill in that sport be what it actually would be, or would it be like good, like to standard?
Yeah, you could be sitting on the bench if you want, like a
Okay,
second goalkeeper,
okay.
backup goalkeeper to Man City or something.
Yeah, nice, nice. That would probably be quite similar then, because then I wouldn't necessarily be found out, but I'd have a really good income for that short period of time until I then got found out. So yeah, something like that would be good.
Wonderful. Um, All right. So if you could go back in time and give younger Tom some advice, what would it be?
Hmm, that's a good question. And the part of me is almost like I maybe wouldn't give myself advice because like I'm quite comfortable with where I'm at right now in my career and life. And if I did give myself advice, would it be that like butterfly effect and I wouldn't end up doing what I'm doing? I'm not sure. Yeah, I'd I may refrain from giving myself advice at this point. Uh, but maybe I don't know. Yeah, it's a real good question. I'd have to think about it more. So not quick fire format for that one.
I'll let you off this time. Um, Brilliant. So last question is Messi or Ronaldo?
Oh, I love Ronaldo, just his like mindset in terms of wanting to be the best and the fact that he clearly is a high performer in like all areas of his life and specifically from our sort of standpoint, seeing someone that really cares about their nutrition to that sort of detail and their training and their longevity is a breath of fresh air. But I mean Messi is like probably well, one of the most, if not the most talented footballer of all time. But yeah, I think from that other side of things, yeah, probably Ronaldo.
Yeah. No, so I definitely agree. And I think like you really respect like the effort that he's put in and to the longevity that he's
Hmm.
had and to maintain like the fitness that he has and to still be doing it at that age and that
Yeah.
high. It's quite incredible.
Hmm.
All right. So yeah, sort of I guess where can people find you if they want to connect with you and or see what you're up to or get some of that good information that you're putting out?
Yeah, so social media is a great way, and Instagram particularly is one of the ones that I try and get as much good info out on there as possible. So that's Tom Nutritionist on Instagram. Um, I post up studies and all sorts of random stuff up there related to nutrition, do some like scientific breakdowns and those kind of things, and just some general practical advice. You can also find me on my website, which is tomcoughlin.co.uk. Again, you can sort of find that through my social media channels as well. So you don't need to try and spell my surname. But yeah, those two places would be best.
Excellent. All right. Yeah, thank you very much, Tom, for stopping by, and I've really enjoyed chatting with you and getting this information out there.
Likewise, Craig. Great to chat.
Hi guys, I just wanted to summarize what Tom and I talked about today. Um, so one of the things we discussed was how like sort of the earlier the better for youth players, and like Tom said, getting the basics right early is going to make a big difference to you or your child in the long term, and you know that those 1%ers sort of add up, and every single day that they're fueling correctly or getting the right fuel in is going to help them out on the field. Each training session, they're going to be able to train harder. We're going to get better adaptations there. They're going to recover better, and then basically they're going to train harder the next day or that week. So yeah, getting the basics right can make a massive difference to the career of a player. And I think it's interesting and something to keep mindful of. Another thing we talked about was fueling. So Tom mentioned that a lot of athletes aren't really fueling enough, and I find this a lot as well. So really, when it comes to being an athlete and to doing a sport, you really want to shift your mindset and to focus on performance. And fueling that performance, or the 24 hours, 24, 36 hours leading up to when you need to perform, you you want to get the fuel right that's coming in, because that's going to help you. So I think a good way to look at it is like, if you fill up your car with a full tank of, high octane fuel before going on a long drive, your car's going to travel further on that tank and it's going to perform better. So in the like other side of things, like if you only filled it with a quarter of the tank and put like average fuel, before you know it, your car's going to take off and, it's going to be coughing and spluttering, and then it's going to come to a stop early because the tank's empty. So yeah, I think that's important to sort of think about when it comes to fueling. Another thing is I like Tom's comments around recovery and how he talked about like light finger foods post game and sort of milk drinks are winners for his athletes. And, I find the same things as well. athletes obviously don't usually want to eat too much, and I think we've discussed this before a few times. They don't want to eat really heavy meals after playing, and I felt the same before as well when I played. So yeah, light finger foods makes sense and keeps it nice and simple and easy to digest. And milk drinks are really big bang for your buck. So, something that's used quite a lot these days is like your chocolate and strawberry milks. The reason for this is, they got a lot of carbs in them. So we're replenishing those glycogen stores quickly. And they've got really good source of protein in it. So not only are we replenishing the glycogen stores, we've got the protein there to help that recovery and speed those things up. So yeah, really big bang for your buck there. One of the things Tom specifically highlighted was sushi, which I've not actually used before. And I think that's a really great option. So obviously there's a rice there to replenish glycogen stores again. And you've got fish there, or you may want to have chicken, but the fish would provide protein, and that's going to rebuild damaged muscles. And then you've got your omega-3, which has anti-inflammatory effects. And then the seaweed wrap, which actually provides like vitamin A, C, and E, as well as like carotenoids and flavonoids. So that's helping repair and restoration. Tom also gave us an insight into his team menu design, and we spoke about adjusting intakes for different training intensities. I think that's really good to sort of think about with your playing and your week. So, generally most teams generally have like a sort of a tapering up, and then so Monday, Tuesday will be sort of easier trainings, but building up. Wednesday is going to be one of your hardest training sessions, and then you're going to sort of taper back down again to a Thursday easier, Friday even easier, and then match day Saturday if you're playing one game a week. Yeah, but if you've got 2 games a week, obviously you've got to think about that again. But basically, think about sort of what am I going to do, or what my training week usually looks like. Have I got a high intensity session middle of the week, or have I got 2 games this week, one in the middle, one at the end? For those games or those high intensity sessions, you're going to need more fuel because you're going to expend more energy. So recovery days, you're not using as much fuel, but we still need to repair. So yeah, Tom highlighted using fruits and vegetables, sort of ramping them up, maybe dropping the carbs a little bit down, focusing on your omega-3s. So this will make sense to speed up repair. Another thing we touched on was Tom talked about sort of substitutes and starting players and how their intakes are modified or different to the starters. So yeah, this goes back to my point about fuel use in the car. If they aren't covering as much volume or distance, they don't need as much fuel. So if they've got too much fuel in the tank and they're not using it, then we've got excess fuel, and that's not really that could be stored as adipose tissue or going to affect player weight or something like that. So that can be thought of as well. If you're starting as a substitute, then you don't necessarily need to fuel as much leading up to the match. But, you may play in a team where game finishes and, you are doing sprints at the end of the game, or trying to cover distances, get the heart rate up, covering X amount of meters to make sure you're meeting your targets for the week. So these are things that to be considered and thought about prior to playing. Tom also talked about sort of body composition changes, and he prefers to make this happen during off season. We discussed adjusting protein and carb intake to create these adaptations as well. So this makes a lot of sense. So, like Tom said, in pre-season, we are going to need a lot of fuel because that's when you're working really hard. During season, performance matters a great deal. So we don't want to sort of alter things too much then. And then in your off season, that's where you can sort of think about adjusting those real body composition changes, maybe reducing body fat percentage or increasing muscle mass. So these have to be thought about and sort of adjusted. That's all for today, guys. You can follow the Football Nutritionist on Instagram and X, and jump onto our blog at thefootballnutritionist.wordpress.com. Remember, keep fueling for success and kicking those goals.